This is our second podcast in this series. We'll be looking at the second part of a question I've had to deal with as of late. As I mentioned in a previous podcast, in this age of disposable marriages, more and more people want answers regarding divorce and remarriage. And so before we venture into this minefield once again, let's remind ourselves of God's perspective on marriage. We read that in the beginning of creation, God said in Genesis 2, verse 18 and then 21 to 23 that it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and while he slept, took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh. And a rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. Then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Taking this into consideration, I believe that it is safe to assume that marriage, that unique relationship between a husband and a wife, from the beginning, was God's idea. In fact, the very concept of marriage was birthed in God's heart. And giving us a glimpse into God's heart, we find Jesus, quoted by Matthew 19 verse 6, saying the following: "They are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." Listening to Jesus' words, I think it's safe to conclude that divorce is always the result of sin. Now, before we continue, please allow me to explain something. Because of what Adam and Eve did, sin entered this world. And with sin came the result called death. And death means that every part of life as we know it has been corrupted. Nothing, and I do mean nothing, has not been infested, infected, invaded or corrupted by sin. Sin embedded itself into everything known to man. We see the evidence of this every day. We constantly complain about the chaos and destruction around us, simply because sin affects each and every one of us. And even though we all crave a better quality of life, we all want a reason for hope, for things to change, for society to change, for people's attitudes to change. The sad part of all of this is, no matter how far we run, no matter where we go, no matter what we do, the effect of sin will always follow us. Somehow, somewhere, sin, and the result of sin, which is death, will be right there waiting for us. Now, death in some cases doesn't just refer to physical death, but also to something unique and special dying. For example, because of sin, trust between two people can be broken. And when trust dies, so does the relationship. For this reason, in some extreme cases, we find that the sacred bond of marriage can be destroyed because something in that relationship died. And even though nothing is impossible with God, we do find that some things are beyond any human ability to repair, because of the damage brought about as a result of sin. And so after all resources to amend a relationship have been depleted, after all humanly possible attempts to reconcile has been without success, I believe God in His grace and as a divine concession to human weakness does allow for us to get divorced. In our previous podcast, I pointed to the fact that God allows for a couple to be divorced for one of two reasons. The first being when one of the spouses were unfaithful, and the second if an unbelieving spouse no longer wants to be married to a believer. This, however, raises another question. What about abuse? What if a husband physically or emotionally abuses his wife? Or his children? Does this mean that divorce is not permitted? Does this mean that just because we don't have any chapter or verse to quote and to back up, just because none of the biblical writers wrote about it, that divorce in such a case would not be permitted? Well, to be honest with you, this is where it becomes tricky, because no matter how we look at it, even though divorce is always the result of death brought about because of sin, divorce should always be the last, not the first option. Just to be clear, I firmly believe that no Christian should ever actively pursue a divorce. In fact, I'll never encourage anyone to seek or get a divorce. And from a pure theological point of view, meaning I do not have any biblical passage to back up what I'm about to say, I will never, especially after all possible attempts at treatment and therapy have been unsuccessful, after all possible resources have been depleted, and all avenues have been exhausted, I will never encourage anyone to stay in a toxic or dangerous relationship. But this is my personal belief. It's not an official, doctrinal, even a denominational belief. But personally, I believe that in extreme cases, when a marriage bond is completely destroyed because of sin, as I've already mentioned before, I believe God in His grace and as a divine concession to human weakness does allow divorce. And if the victim of abuse, after exhausting every avenue, wants to get a divorce, I will personally walk alongside such a person and be there every step of the way towards healing. I know not everyone agrees with me on this, and not everyone feels the same way I do about this touchy subject. I even might be wrong. But I'll reserve judgment on this for the one whom the writer of Hebrews in Hebrews 4 verse 15 refers, the one who sympathizes with our weaknesses because he was in every respect tempted just as we are, yet he never sinned.